Good evening. I am Brenda Lawson, the interim president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. It occurred to me that this talk was originally scheduled for February when the weather was a bit different. So I want to welcome those of you who've braved the heat to join us here in our nice, cool space, and more than 250 of you joining us online. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson, who will be in conversation with the MHS Director of Research, Dr. Kanasorn Rongsri. Our program tonight is funded by the MHS Speakers Fund, which began with a generous gift from Charles and Kitty Ames to support talks with leading scholars of American history who contribute to a deeper public understanding of the American experience. I also want to thank the National History Day students and their families for joining us earlier this evening to share their projects. I hope those of you here, spontaneous applause. I hope those of you here in person had a chance to take a look at their exciting work, and it sounds like you did. So, on to the program. Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson is the Michael and Denise Kellen 68 Associate Professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She studies the lived experiences of Black people with a focus on slavery, abolitionism, the Civil War, political violence, Black women's history, and film. She is the author of the award-winning book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Her essays have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and other outlets. Dr. Jackson's latest book, We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance, reframes the past and present of Black resistance to white oppression, particularly those methods pioneered by Black women. So I will invite Dr. Jackson to take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. The Massachusetts Historical Society feels like home to me, so being here always feels good. I should say, for those who are in the back, there are seats in the front row if you're not shy. You can come on up. It's okay. I won't bite. So first, I just want to say how happy I am to be here. I know how difficult it is to get people to come out during snow and rain and not optimal weather, and even in the heat like this today, to be able to have this kind of audience is just, it really, really makes me happy, and I feel so honored to see people in the room, but also online as well, so thank you for that. I'm just going to start by telling some stories from my book, We Refuse. It's actually having its 1-year anniversary right now. It came out in June of last year. And I am really, really proud of it. So what I'm going to do today is share some stories from the book with a little bit of time that I have. I also want to tell people, too, that, I have 10 jobs. I tell people all the time that I am a professor, I'm a historian, I am a wife and a mom, I have 3 kids, I'm a podcaster, I do a lot of consulting, I do a lot of documentaries. I am busy. So if you have any questions at the end about, what does it mean to sort of be a public intellectual, and what does it mean to do this work right now, I'm really happy to answer those questions. I also think that now, in the current moment that we're living in, historians have so much more work to do than just sort of tell the history. And so that's what I'm hoping to do, to get the truth out to as many people as who will listen. So I tell people that I am a storyteller, first and foremost, and I'm going to start out by telling some stories. The first story is about my great-grandmother, Arnesta, who was about 9 years old when she stepped on a rusty nail. Not long after, infection began to set in, likely tetanus. Her mother, Mary Bullard, was frantic. Arnesta was her only child, and she was going to lose her if she did not act fast. Mary sent Arnesta to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in a big house on the other side of town. The white doctor offered to help, but in exchange, Arnesta would have to live with him for the rest of her life, working for his family. Growing up Black and a girl in 1915 left her vulnerable. In rural Alabama, during one of the worst periods of race relations in America, these were the detestable but predictable terms of engagement. Mary, panic-stricken and not wanting to lose her daughter to death, agreed. Thankfully, Martha, Mary's mother and a former slave, who's not pictured here, intervened and refused the doctor's proposal. She picked up her ailing granddaughter and took her home. There, Martha administered every natural remedy at her disposal. Ernestina survived, but for the rest of her life, she walked with a limp. Whatever space she entered, whatever path she took, she was marked by an imprint of racial violence. My mother told me, who's here today, my mother and my father, my mother told me this story when I was a child to explain my great-grandmother's limp. It was not until I was an adult that I realized that the rusty nail was not the root of her trauma. This story has always gripped me for several reasons. First, Ernestina was a child, her mother's only child. How could a doctor refuse a dying child medical care when it was in his ability to heal her? He had abandoned his oath, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Second, nearly 50 years out from slavery, white folks still felt entitled to black labor in life and perpetuity. Clearly, everything was transactional to this white doctor. Built into the deal he offered was a lifetime of servitude and likely physical and sexual abuse. White supremacy in America can be summed up by these two diabolical options: live a life in bondage or refuse and limp. To be black in America is to limp. My great-grandmother's gait had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with power. The power of the white doctor to neglect and attempt to exploit a little black girl who came to him for help. But this book is not about the white doctor or the millions of people like him. In many ways, this book is about my great-great-great-grandmother's response, her refusal. It is about her rescue to save my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, myself, and even my daughters. Her refusal was not just no, but never. Refusal is a forceful no. It is a no that is packed full of energy and meaning. We refuse is similar to black colloquialisms such as nah, or nope, or not today, Satan, or my personal favorite, oh, hell no. I was recently asked about the difference between resistance and refusal. For me, resistance is how one responds to white supremacy, but refusal is why. Refusal abhors oppression and insists on defining how humanity should be understood and treated with dignity, respect, and decency. Non-verbally, refusal is a halting hand or a pointed finger waving from side to side or a powerful raised fist. It is a barrier that prevents oppressed people from being consumed. And refusal can be enacted by an individual, as in this woman here who's snatching off this officer's face. But at its heart, refusal is collective. This is the washerwoman's strike at the end of the 19th century. Which is why the sentiment behind the phrase, we refuse, persists among subjugated people and is a key refrain in black feminist politics as well as Native politics. Black women have refused to be invisible or small. And this entire book consists of examples of black people refusing lies, violence, theft, mockery, or second-class citizenship. It shows how our refusal denies whiteness and white supremacy its power and unearned authority. My ancestors' refusal was foundational to her granddaughter's survival. First, she refused the doctor's offer. Then, she sought every natural remedy she possessed to stop the infection and heal Ernestina's body. She did not plead or bargain with the doctor. She did not try to convince him that Ernestina was a child or human. Often, when black people are up against white violence, society presents them with two options. Are you going to be violent, like Malcolm X is allegedly accused of, or Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolence? Are you going to throw a Molotov cocktail? Are you going to pray and forgive? These become the options, violence or nonviolence. But I contend that my ancestors' refusal, her remedy and protection, transcended violence or nonviolence. First, Martha took the doctor out of the equation. The doctor had no compassion for the child. He could not be morally persuaded. Nonviolence would have ensured my great-grandmother's death, and violence against the doctor would have been a death sentence for them. Friends, today I am here to tell you that we have more than two options. Black people need not choose between death or certain life in bondage. We have throughout history approached such violence with an array of responses and refusals. So today, with the time I have remaining, I want to tell another story. This is a story that comes from chapter 3 of my book about a young girl named Carrie Johnson. Carrie Johnson was 17 years old, and her bravery compelled her to fight off an angry mob and defend herself. It was 1919, and Black soldiers had returned from war to Red Summer. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, he claimed, we return from fighting, we return fighting. During the middle of July, the nation's capital exploded with racial violence, and white men began to terrorize Black communities. For 5 days, the city of D.C. was in chaos regarding the rumored arrest of a Black man accused of raping a white woman. Armed white mobs gathered in Black communities and shot into their windows, pelted rocks at their homes, and pulled Black folk off streetcars to beat them. During the fourth straight night of rioting, a 17-year-old girl, Carrie, and her father, Benjamin Johnson, were in their home when the mob came to their neighborhood. Their home was a modest 2-story brick house, and their immediate neighborhood was Black, but it was surrounded by white neighborhoods, and the white residents greatly outnumbered the Black ones. Around 1,000 white people stormed the streets headed toward Black homes such as the Johnsons. Armed with pistols and rifles, the Black community was doing all it could to keep the mob at bay. Sitting in her window, overlooking New York Avenue, Carrie took pot shots at the white mob prowling the streets below. She clearly knew how to use a gun and understood the advantage of being higher up. She could see everyone from below as well as from a distance. And she had good aim, shooting and hitting one of the white men storming her block. The police officers were present. No police officer was interested in stopping the white mobs from destroying Black property and harming Black people. In fact, 2 police officers were notified of a person taking shots from a window and pointed at Carrie's home. At this point, Carrie and her father were hiding inside their house under a bed on the 2nd floor. 2 white officers broke down the front door of the Johnson residence and did not identify themselves. The house was dark and quiet. The officers crept up the staircase with their guns ready. They made it up to the 2nd floor and pushed their way into a dark bedroom. As the officers opened the door, shots rang out. Carrie started shooting from under the bed. Bewildered, the officers shot at the walls, but Carrie was relentless. She took several shots and hit Officer Wilson twice. He fell to the floor. A bullet struck Carrie in her thigh. Another struck her father, Benjamin, in the shoulder. But they were alive. Officer Wilson was not. When the gunfire finally ceased, other officers dragged Carrie and her father from under the bed and marched them to the street in handcuffs. The authorities were baffled that a teenage girl had committed such an act of forceful armed defense. As people stood around wondering what might happen next, suddenly it began to rain and then pour. The torrential rain broke the mob's will to continue. So don't be mad, but you're going to have to read my book to find out what happens to Carrie. I always got to have a little cliffhanger. But I will tell you this, what I find equally fascinating about Carrie's story is the way that Black women across the country stand for this teenage girl. Everyone knew what she was up against, too heavy a load. Immediately, funds were raised for Carrie's legal defense. One Black woman wrote a letter to the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. She praised Black people for fighting back. As she read about the Washington riot, the woman said she wept tears of gladness and madness. Those who knew about Carrie and turned her into a folk hero in the Black press. Perhaps the most poignant was a poem written by an 11-year-old Black girl named Martina Sims. Martina Sims' poem was published in the Baltimore's Afro-American, and she wrote about the riot that day, but she singled out Carrie's bravery. You read about Carrie Johnson, who was only 17. She killed a detective. Wasn't she brave and keen? And I was like, oh, it rhymes. This is so cute. I don't know. My son is 11. I don't know if he would put together a poem like this and have it published in the newspaper. But it was clear that Carrie was celebrated. People wrote to Black newspapers to find out what they could do to support her. Ella Rice, treasurer of the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, wrote a letter to the president of the NAACP in hopes of securing aid for Carrie. Rice noted that Black women held Carrie in high regard and considered the harsh punishment she might face. In Rice's mind, Carrie was a young girl caught up in a horrible situation. She had compassion for her. And during the era of respectability politics among the Black community, it would have been easy to disown Carrie. But at every turn, the Black community showed empathy for her circumstances and admiration for her actions. When the Washington riot ended, the death toll was an anomaly during Red Summer. More white people were killed than Black people. In total, 15 people had died, and 10 of them were white, including 2 police officers, one of which was killed by Carrie. This book reframes the conversation around the rightness or wrongness of nonviolence and instead focuses on what happens when we place Black liberation and resistance at the center. I ask, how have oppressed people responded to their oppressors? And how should they respond? How do the powerless procure power? White violence is the perennial stumbling block to racial progress in America. And Black people spend much of their lives, if not their entire lives, combating, addressing, avoiding, and subverting white violence. It is impossible to write a book that offers a critical analysis on violence and does not interrogate white supremacy as the lead perpetrator. We demand that people of color remain nonviolent, but we fail to ask the most important question. Why are white Americans so violent? Why are white Americans so violent? This book is not about how white supremacy has impacted the Black community. Rather, it illustrates the Black community's response to racial violence and instead focuses on what works. Refusal makes a case for how we might understand Black humanity and rage in the pursuit of freedom. So my book is encased of 5 chapters. I look at revolution, protection, force, flight, and joy. And I readily admit that even these broad categories are not exhaustive. But in Refusal, I hope to uncover them as a set of possibilities among many. I chose these 5 categories of Black response because throughout my life, I have researched, witnessed, or experienced the utility of them all. Their impacts can blend into one another. Sometimes revolutions involve force. Sometimes flight is motivated by protection. Sometimes flight and force are joyful. Like I tell people all the time about the Montgomery Brawl that happened maybe a couple summers ago, in which you saw Black people defending this white dock worker. And even though it was a terrible, violent brawl, the joy that came from that altercation in memes on the internet and GIFs and videos and reenactments was something worth studying. So, if you are like me, you may be thinking about the state of the world, the state of politics, Iran, or Israel, or Gaza, or ICE, or academia, or the state of our climate or healthcare system, the state of our prison system, the state of our educational system. And if you are like me, you might be angry. You should be. Anger is useful, as Audre Lorde argued. Anger prevents you from becoming stagnant and resigned. Anger is the engine of refusal. But our anger should never be left alone. It must be tethered to hope, and hope is tethered to joy, and hope and joy stem from a place of purpose and promise. I think about the activist Wendell Erdman Berry, who is a writer and a farmer and environmentalist, and he argues that when it comes to fixing societal problems, people often want a solution as large-scale as the problem. But rarely can any major problem be solved in this way. Instead, he suggested what is needed is countless small solutions that can chip away at the core issues. But small interpersonal solutions do not satisfy America's need for drama. At a surface level, refusal and joy can feel inadequate. At best, it can feel dismissive and worst, like salt in a wound. But refusal is not a simple declaration. It is a verb. Moreover, joy is not mere optimism, nor is it ease. It is the conviction that nothing big or small can be tackled without first believing it is possible. I think about the small but powerful ways you and I can refuse and find joy to combat violent systems. And in these hard times, I also think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said very aptly, "These are revolutionary times. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world declaring eternal opposition to poverty and racism and militarism." And to this I say yes, and joy is a weapon. And I think it's important to talk about this too, because we often see MLK in a suit, protesting, being arrested, in jail, but it's this picture that I draw a lot of inspiration from. And this is a picture of MLK on the beach. He's not in a suit. Matter of fact, he's shirtless. And he's resting. He needed a respite. And so do we. It's going to be a long 4 years, hate to tell you. But I see in this picture, I see him in the pool. I see him walking along the beach with his wife, Coretta. I see them on the veranda eating dinner together. And I think to myself, if MLK took vacations, if he took space for himself to replenish and then go back into the fight, how much more should we use that as a model for ourselves as well? Not to leave the country, not to move to Ireland, not to check out, but to take a break and then come back into the fight. So I want to close, but I want to close with my epilogue, which feels like a pivot, but it kind of ties into, I don't know, swimming somehow. So, and this is a story that my husband told me about when he was a lifeguard in high school. And he took it, as a summer job, as a lot of high schoolers do, at his local beach. And he said that during his training, his instructors discussed what to do if they saw someone drowning. If the person was panicking, he needed to be careful. A person who was flailing could drown a lifeguard by attempting to jump on them and push them underwater. If the panicking, drowning person was bigger than him, this could be a real problem. The instructor's guidance was simple. Let them drown. It is better to rescue a person after they've lost consciousness than risk being pulled under. Once unconscious, they can be safely rescued and brought to shore, and then the lifeguard or paramedic can conduct CPR and resuscitate them. Let them drown. It seems harsh, but I understood the rationale behind it. A panicked person is a danger to themselves and others. I think about this principle often. It is though white Americans are lounging in a community pool, propped up by all kinds of floaties because they cannot swim. They fear someone, a woman, an immigrant, or a trans person, is going to remove a device that allows them to float, so they scream, they splash, they kick, and lose their balance. White people fear the loss of their superiority, advantage, and safety. They are irrational. They do not need to hoard the floaties. In fact, they can just stand up, and the water will be at their waist. But they do not trust anyone. They are kicking and punching and flailing their arms in a panic. In a toxic political environment, I ask myself, how should we approach these people? Do we let them drown? What does that look like? What does that mean for American democracy? Letting someone drown is a refusal to engage a panicked person, Many Black people know what rescue and resuscitation looks like in a democracy. It is a work in activism that Black women do daily at our jobs, in our communities, and for our families. And there's nothing good in America that can be accomplished without our labor and intellect. When we refuse, revolt, quit, leave, withhold, strike, boycott, or simply carve out spaces that deny the white gaze, institutions must concede. Allowing the drowning is the demand that white people must relinquish their hold on power and violence and control. The warning before the drowning is to call out, let go, stand up. You are not dying. When America is rescued or resuscitated, then people will have to answer the hard questions. How do we engage each other as human beings? When Jamaica Kincaid wrote A Small Place regarding the fraught understanding of her relationship with her native home of Antigua, she wrote about Christopher Columbus's discovery of the island in 1493. She concluded by saying that European settlers and slaveholders were rubbish, and all enslaved people were noble and exalted. In her mind, there was nothing to contest. Men and women who engaged in the practice of slavery were trash, and people who were enslaved were honorable and even morally superior. But when slavery collapsed, everyone had to reckon with their own humanity and the humanity of others. Kincaid acknowledged this. Once you cease to be a master, you are no longer human rubbish. You are just a human being, and all that adds up to. The same could be said of the enslaved. Once they are no longer slaves, once they are free, they are no longer noble and exalted. They are just human beings. White or Black or Native with slavery, there are no humans. For people to become human, slavery needed to be eradicated, and Black people were unafraid to act. They were willing to trade in their identity as noble and exalted slaves to be human. But too many white Americans have settled into their identity as rubbish. For too many white Americans, it is better to be hated than human. In 1993, science fiction author Octavia Butler published her book, Peril of the Sower, about an apocalyptic United States that is ravaged by corrupt leadership and deadly plagues and rapid violence, all in the year of 2024. You should read the book, it's good. She wrote, this is one of her epitaphs, drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. Drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. Black Americans and other people of color cannot risk their lives saving someone who is unwilling to recognize the harm their panic is causing. The wise lifeguard will watch and wait. And it can be agonizing, but waiting is not careless. The refusal is not so much a no as a not now. When the hysterical swimmer grows tired and weary and weak and is just on the brink of unconsciousness, then and only then will the lifeguard rescue them from the water. In the chaotic world that Americans live in, Black people can pull in the heavy, unconscious bodies of extremism and hope that their revival from a near-death experience will be transformative. Or we can let whiteness drown in the violence of its own making. But when we refuse, it is in our power to determine how we can best preserve our lives and the lives of others. So as I close in this last paragraph, I feel it's imperative that I return to my ancestor, Martha, who refused, and Arnesta, who limped. I talked about her limp, but the limp was not the totality of her. She lived, she loved, she actually got married 5 times. She laughed. This is her in the picture with my grandfather. She threw elaborate parties and gatherings. She never knew a stranger. And she poured into the lives of others and into the life of my mother, who's here at age 3 years old. She refused, like Martha did. And in her refusal, she found joy. Thank you.
I have so many questions for you,
Okay.
but I want to make sure that we have time for questions from our audience as well.
Okay.
Welcome home, Kelly.
Hey, I'm happy to be home.
Did not mention this, but Professor Jackson is also one of the founders of the African American History Seminar Series here at the MHS, where we learn about some of the latest and most exciting scholarship on African American history.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we'll start there with research, because we
Okay.
do have lots of students here.
Okay.
And so maybe this is a question for the historian in the 21st century,
Yeah.
and also for young historians as well. You are drawing on a whole variety of different types of sources I've never seen before in a book. You're looking at hashtags, you're looking at YouTube videos,
Yes.
you're looking at TikToks.
Yes, gifts.
Would you like to comment on your use of sources
Yes,
as an
I
historian?
would. So I am a historian by training, but I'm also chair of the Africana Studies Department. And one of the things that I value about being in a field that is interdisciplinary is that I don't just have to pull on historical sources. I can be a little bit more expansive, and I love that about Africana Studies. I can use poetry, I can look at literature, I can look at art, I can look at social media, I can look at, op-eds and commentary, and for me, that allows me and the reader to have a much more robust, relatable conversation. One of the things I'm trying to do now is write for accessibility. I don't want to write to just the 10 people in my field. While that will get you tenure, it won't sort of accomplish the change that I really want to see in the world. And so writing in a way where a high schooler or a college student or my mother could read it and say, oh, I get this. Oh, this makes sense to me. That was really important.
AI.
Oh, God. AI is like a demon child. It is like, I am so torn by this, because since I took on the role as being chair of my department, one of my colleagues was like, one way that you can be more efficient is using AI to respond to your emails. And I was like, what? Tell me more. And I realized, though, that while there are aspects of AI that are useful or that has a utility to it, because we are so woefully unprepared, I think, for how to use this tool. And I see it in my students. I have like an AI policy on my syllabus, and I can tell like when AI has written the essay, I'm like, you don't speak like this in class. This is not how we write things. I'm really disturbed by it. And I'm equally disturbed because AI, or the programmers and the developers that are creating these algorithms, they are not representative of people in the world. And so when you want to get an African American perspective, when you want to get someone who's disabled perspective, when you want to get an immigrant perspective, you are not getting that. And that can be really frustrating if all of your information is being curated or funneled through a white male gaze. That's deeply problematic.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to do with AI. It's the future. It's coming for us. It's right here. But we have to really get creative and conscious about how we combat it.
Yeah. But we're using new sources, which is really exciting. I mean, this is usually a reading room. This
Yes,
is where people
yes.
use paper documents mostly and whatnot. But of course, like sharks, historians just keep looking for new sources and keep finding new foods.
Yeah.
So that's great. Now, you've also done something that historians generally do not do, which is you've woven your family history into this book.
Yeah.
Now, you want to talk a little bit about that and
Yes.
why we maybe should do more of it or not?
So this is going to sound silly, but like I told you, I have 3 children, young children, and I had watched the movie Coco. Anybody see the movie Coco? And it's like, you don't really die until the last person says your name, and I thought that was so powerful. And when I think about my ancestors, I wanted their names to live on. And selfishly, I thought, well, my mother had told me this story about my great-grandmother, Ernesta, and she had told me about Mary. And just recently, I found out that Mary's mother's name was Martha. In the book, actually, Martha's name is not mentioned because I didn't know what her name was. And then when I found out, I asked for the paperback for Martha's name to be put in the paperback. So check the paperback for Martha's name. But like, I wanted to give my family a legacy that people could come back to and read their names and speak their names again and again. And it was just supposed to be for the introduction. I was like, oh, this is a great way to set up the book. It's a nice, little anecdote. And then I thought, well, what if I started every chapter with a family anecdote, with a family story? And so I used my brother's story with sickle cell to talk about revolution. I used my grandmother's story to talk about force. I used my daughter to talk about joy. And I think it's important because here's the thing. There is no such thing as objectivity. There is none. People are political, and the personal is political, and the political is personal. And so for me, it feels more honest to write in a way where I am telling you exactly what I think, exactly how I feel, and exactly how it impacts me. And you can agree or disagree with that, but you'll know that I'm telling you the truth. And I want students to do that as well, even in their papers. I want them to think about their own experiences, their own historical relationships with history, and take that knowledge, take your family heritage, and allow it to help you make sense of the world around you. Because that's what we do all the time. We say, oh, that was just like my grandmother, or that was just like my sister's story, or we find something about George Washington or John Adams that feels relatable because it feels like someone we know. That is how we make history matter and how we make it meaningful.
I completely agree with you. I taught for many years in West Texas, and these are kids who would ask, I know it's sacrilegious under this roof to say, but who cares about John Adams? What did John Adams ever do for me? But to tie their stories into the narrative of American history makes it real and alive.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Okay, well, let me turn to a passage that you wrote in here, which sort of leapt out. So this is from page 73.
Okay.
Okay.
I have no idea what this is going to be.
Okay. Revolution involves the total transformation of society and the liberation of all people, not a few. Thus, the American Revolution did not radically transform colonial society in a way that lived up to the principle fought for, that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the aftermath of the Revolution, the overwhelming majority of black Americans were still enslaved. Native Americans had no protection for their Western lands. White farmers who had been given cheap incentives to fight were still largely cut out of the economy by the planter class. And women, who made major contributions to the war efforts, saw no changes in their social or political status despite their overwhelming support of white supremacy in the new nation. Americans had merely supplied the rhetoric of black freedom efforts, but they never intended to extend freedom to the masses. For black Americans, the revolution replaced a distant white supremacist tyrant supportive of black enslavement with local and elected white supremacist tyrants empowered to preserve the existing social, political, and economic order, which was grounded in slavery and anti-blackness. The revolution was not merely imperfect, it was not true. And you say that the American Civil War was the real revolution, which as a Civil War historian, I agree with you, but at this time, where the nation's marking the 250th of the American Revolution, those are fighting words.
Fighting words. These are fighting words. I think it would be more appropriate to call the American Revolution a war of independence than it is to call it a revolutionary war. Because just like you quoted, what revolutionary changes for black people, for Native Americans, for poor white people, for women, nothing really changes systemically, structurally for them. And to me, if you are going to have a revolution, it can't just be freedom for a few. It can't just be liberatory for the founding fathers. It can't just be liberatory for people who owned large amounts of land. It has to change everything for everyone. And I think the greatest revolution there was the Haitian Revolution, because it actually did what it set out to do, which was not just sever ties from France, but abolish the institution of slavery so that Haiti becomes the only black independent nation in the Western Hemisphere to overthrow colonial power and dismantle the institution of slavery. You don't see that anywhere else. France does not do that in its revolution. The United States does not do that in its revolution. You can talk about like the revolution that happens in Latin America in Simon Bolivar, but he only has success because Haiti said, we won't help you unless you abolish the institution of slavery. That is how slavery gets abolished in Latin America, because of Haitian efforts and because of the urging of them to, like, you know, destroy slavery. So I said what I said.
Well, all right. Well, to push back on it a little.
That doesn't mean it wasn't important.
No,
I should say that. That
that's
doesn't
right.
mean it wasn't important.
So what message should we take from the 250th?
The work continues. The work of democracy, the work of revolution is ongoing. It is not just, you know, it is not just words that have been written down. It's not just founding fathers. It's so much more than that. And I think we have to really expand our ideas of what freedom and liberation and revolution should entail. And if it's not working for the good of everyone, then I just don't want it. And what I think is really encouraging, at least at this sort of, is it sesquicentennial? How do we say this?
I prefer the sestercentennial.
Yeah, 250th
Yes.
anniversary. What's really important that I'm seeing, at least in my circles, and maybe I'm in a bubble, but I think people really are trying to do that work. I think they're trying to reassess and revise and reimagine, how can we make the country live up to its principles? How can we actually be the America that it was slated to be, not just on paper, but in reality? And even though it doesn't feel like that because it's chaotic right now, I do feel like that there are forces that are trying to accelerate and push those efforts.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Haitian Revolution. That goes to the next quotation I pulled out from this, from your book. This is 62. The violence of white supremacy is also bound up in forgetting. That black revolutionary victories have been marginalized and forgotten is not accidental. The French did not just want to eliminate black leadership. They sought to erase black history because history often serves as a roadmap to a possible future.
Yeah.
In marginalizing the past, white people were attempting to make black people beholden to an identity stuck in subordination. That has more resonance given
Yeah.
what's happened
Yeah.
in the recent past. The Globe reports today, for example, that there are real threats to institutions related to African American history here in the city of Boston.
Yeah, they are trying to not just dismantle the the Museum of African American History here in Boston. Also, I call it affectionately the Blacksonian in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. The National Parks and Recreation, they're trying to change signage. They're trying to get people to report on historical documents that make people feel bad about being American. They're trying to change not just the signage, but the curriculum, what goes in the exhibits, what's being taught, what's being told. And I don't think we appreciate how much erasure is violence. Erasure is violence. That when you cut those stories out, not just when you edit them or tweak them, but when you eradicate them, you effectively change how we understand what it means to be American, who is American. And that, to me, is really scary. I think that we ought to be really clever about how we sort of approach these ideas, because we think that history is superficial, it doesn't matter, oh, it's just facts and dates and names and places and people, and, you know, it's boring. And if it was all those things, let me tell you, they would not be working overtime to dismantle it. They would not be putting forth all of these efforts to make sure that textbooks were changed, to make sure that tenure, security, academic freedom is no longer available for people in my field. The fact that they are targeting museums and historical sites tells you how valuable they are. And, you know, I got to give it up to the conservatives. They know that history matters, and I appreciate that they know that it matters. But also, I am terrified in the ways that they want to weaponize erasure as a tool to propagate their own propaganda.
Yeah. I read your book when it came out last June. Congratulations, 1 year anniversary. And about a month after that, Vice President Kamala Harris became the nominee for the Democratic Party. And one of the central messages of her campaign was joy. And I went right back to your book and I said, she's channeling this really important thing that Kellie's brought out. Would you like to talk a little bit about the historic campaign, the use, the channeling of that joy
Yeah.
and the reaction to it?
Yes. I think we also don't have a deep appreciation for the work of joy. Joy to me is a weapon. It is a tool. It is what fortifies us. It is not mere happiness. It is not just like, oh, I found $1. Joy. Like that is not what joy is. Joy actually is birthed from suffering. It is birthed from hardship. It is what human beings have to pull on in order to survive the violence and the hardship of the world that we live in. It is the only way we can sort of navigate in our right minds when we have joy. I don't know if many of you remember in 2020, there were, massive protests across the country, and you would see people protesting and marching, and they would be shouting, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And then like 5 minutes later, there would be like a boombox, and then the electric slide, and then people would start dancing, and all of a sudden sort of the protest became like a parade, or the protest became, a way of insisting on Black humanity, insisting on Black joy. And I try to do that, in my life. I try to practice that principle all the time. All the time. I had a garden party at my house on Saturday, which was largely inspired because of Meghan Markle and her show on Netflix. And I wanted to do something that was like soft and easy and floral and all that stuff. But when I brought together these group of women, I told them like, I wondered, I questioned if I should have this party because, ICE was snatching people off the streets. That same night, the United States had bombed Iran, and it just felt silly to try to say, come to my house to smell some flowers, But I was like, no, the last chapter of We Refuse is joy, and we need that more than ever to fortify each other, to feed one another, to be in fellowship one another, so that we can actually go out and do the work, so that we can be fortified to go out and do the work. So I don't take joy lightly at all. But joy doesn't mean easy. I think it's so important to say that. Joy, I said it in the talk, it is not mere optimism, nor is it ease. It does not guarantee you anything. It is simply meant to help you navigate these really tough, perilous times.
All right. Thank you. Let's go to questions from our audience. We want to make sure there's time for that. And I'd like the first question to come from one of our students here from National History Day, if one of you has a question. I think there's one over there. We've got a microphone in the back. Please wait for that.
Hi. So, I'm a high school student.
Can you stand? Would you
Yeah,
stand?
of course.
And tell me your name, please.
My name is Anouk, and I'm a high school student, and I've lived in America all my life. And one of the things I find really interesting about resistance and how resistance comes up in education and in America is that we have so much dedicated to Martin Luther King, which is amazing, obviously, and his kind of gospel for peace and happiness and love for one another. But as I was doing my research, which is more about the Nation of Islam and the more radical changes that were made, I kind of realized that we put so much focus on change that is peaceful and change that is radical, change that can be seen as violent is not a part of my high school, my education, my experience. And I was just wondering, like, what you think about that and why you think that is. Is it discomfort? Is it something else? I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, a very good question. And I think that there's so many ways to answer that. One, thank you, Anouk, thank you. One, I think that we have really diluted the principles that Martin Luther King stood for. So we have dwindled him down into like marches and protests and nonviolence and peace. And he was pushing for so much more than that. There's a reason he was assassinated. And it wasn't because he was trying to give everyone like the Care Bear, share or stare or whatever. It's because he was really trying to dismantle these systems. And I think that sometimes we don't realize how much nonviolence gets weaponized or used in a way that is intended to keep you ineffective. So there's this really good book that's, I can't forget, Peter Gellerus, I think is his name, where he talks about how nonviolence is a tool of the state, how nonviolence is promoted by the state because they understand the ways in which nonviolence or mere protest alone is ineffective. So when we think about the summer of 2020 and it's like, oh, the largest protest in modern American history and millions of people were out on the streets, and it's like, yeah, but what actually changed? Nothing changed. Some streets' names changed, some signs came down, Aunt Jemima got a new name, but nothing, some flags came down, but the things that people were demanding never actually was realized. And so I want to put less emphasis, not just on nonviolence, but how we have made nonviolence only protest, only marches, only hashtags. That's not sufficient. And I think we operate in these binaries that are just not, they are not effective because they only give you one aspect of something. No, nonviolence on its own is not going to work. Violence on its own as well is not going to work either. So part of the way I put these chapters together is how do we expand our ideas about what does work? Revolution works, force works, flight works, boycotts work, strikes work, joy works. Like, how can we think outside of these binaries? Because we're getting tripped up. Like, if it's violence, we say, oh no, it's terrible. If it's nonviolence, we say, that's the only thing you can do. And there's so much more than that to really get the change that we want to see.
Other questions? From anyone?
Yeah, Victoria.
Hi, thank you for the talk. As you know, I've read your book, and you mentioned earlier that one of the goals that you have for your writing now is to make it more accessible, which kind of the conceit, if it can so be called, of the personal stories, I think really gives like a nice entry point to each chapter. I also noticed that each chapter focused on one, maybe two very powerful stories, and I imagine they're like hundreds, thousands.
Yeah.
So I'm so curious how you chose, what your process was for choosing the stories that you chose to highlight in those chapters.
Oh, that's a good question. I specifically wanted to choose stories that I knew had not gotten a lot of light or a lot of shine or attention. And so I use my students oftentimes as sort of like a meter for figuring out like what they know, what they don't know. So what I would tell them about like Solitude in Guadeloupe, who's this pregnant woman warrior who's fighting against the French. They're like, say what now? This who? This pregnant woman. And I was like, okay, this is gold. So I have to tell this story. Or I feel like my students know about the Little Rock Nine. They maybe heard about that in Arkansas, but they didn't really know about Daisy Bates. They didn't know that she was the champion and the leader of it and what her and her husband were doing. And so my goal in every class I teach is to do two things. One, introduce my students to something new, something that they don't know, but also take something that I think they do know and show them something different and give them a different aspect of it. So I can talk about someone like Harriet Tubman or someone like Rosa Parks, and I can say to them, you know, we know a lot about Rosa Parks. And everyone's like, oh yeah, we know Rosa Parks, we know her. And I said, okay, quote her. And they were like, you can quote MLK all day long, so quote her. And they're like, And that's one thing that I think is so important. We have muted Rosa Parks. We have silenced Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks had a lot to say, and not just about the Montgomery bus boycott, but about like South African apartheid, about the war in Iraq. She was literally an activist until the day she died. She even talked about, you know, her almost being sexually assaulted and how she almost killed her assailant. And I mean, those stories just like completely blow my mind away, because I'm reading a story of Rosa Parks, and she's talking about how she was almost raped, and she said, I was going to kill him or I was going to die. And if I died, well, then he was welcome to rape a dead body, but over my dead body. And I was like, Rosa Rosa Parks. Like, it just, that to me was just incredible. And also the fact that she had been doing like activism 20 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. So when MLK shows up to Montgomery, she's like, listen here, son, we've been doing this 20 years. Like, you just showed up. I've been here. I've been doing this work. You know, there's another story I tell about Rosa Parks where she talks about how her whole kitchen table was covered with guns because the Klan was so violent, they had to constantly defend themselves. These are stories that I think are intentionally forgotten. You know, I tell my students all the time, forgetting is political. We don't just, oops, don't know how we forgot that. No, we forgot that on purpose. Why? So a lot of my work is about recovering those stories about people we think we know that we don't.
One last question.
Hi, my name is Priscilla Douglas, and I'm wondering about Haiti and the current situation in Haiti. I always tell my Haitian students, you need to stand up and be proud. Your lineage is Toussaint Louverture. And that was the most successful revolution. And I'm wondering whether you think that story has been buried and resources withheld because of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I talk in Force and Freedom, my first book, about Haiti and how the abolitionists actually got inspiration not from the founding fathers, but from Jean-Jacques Dessalines, from Toussaint Louverture, from Henry Christophe, from the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, because they actually accomplished the dismantling of the institution of slavery. We don't talk about the Haitian Revolution enough. I ask my students all the time, you know, do you know about the American Revolution? Yes. Do you know about the French Revolution? Yes. How many of you studied the Haitian Revolution? Maybe 2 or 3 hands, and nearly all of them are Haitian. Like, so, you know, like getting that, we have made it a footnote in textbooks. We've made it sort of like a small little, but we haven't really featured it with the prominence that it deserves. And that too is intentional. I think that part of the efforts of both France and the United States is about diminishing the real power that Haiti had. People forget that during the 19th century, Haiti had the second highest quality of living in the Western world. If you wanted to live well, you lived in Haiti. That's how it was. Not just for white people, but for black people as well. That there were efforts to recruit black Americans to come to the island. They actually succeeded in getting about 3,000 black Americans to move to the island. The Haitian government promised land. They promised, coffee. They were trying to get all these different incentives for people to come and live on the island because they couldn't get diplomatic recognition. The United States refused to acknowledge Haiti as an independent state until the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln needed to use like Haitian ports and Haitian soldiers to help block the Confederacy. And Haiti was like, are you gonna give us diplomatic recognition? And they're like, okay, if you help us, yeah, we'll recognize you. But like that was almost 60, 70 years after they had already won their independence. And then you talk about, the debt that France requires Haitians to pay, crippling its economy for centuries. What has happened to Haiti is violent. And it's meant to be a lesson, to say, this is what happens when black people are victorious. We will destroy you for winning. And that's what they've tried to do to Haiti. And Haiti still refuses. To this day, the stories are negative, but Haiti is still refusing, and that spirit of resilience is well and alive and thriving on the island.
Thank you so much to Kelly and Ken Soren for a wonderful discussion, and thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening. Please join me in another round of applause for our speakers. At the MHS, we host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. We are able to do so because of the support provided by friends like you. To learn more about these and other programs and how you can support the MHS, please visit our website. And Kellie has kindly agreed to sign copies of her book in the library. So if you have a copy you'd like her to sign, please make your way to the library. And thank you and good night.